everybody. Welcome back to the Fly Fishing Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Christian Bicassa. This week, we've got Corbin Reinhardt on the line. Corbin, you're out of York, PA. I'm a PA guy myself, actually out of Pittsburgh originally, but that was a long time ago. I've been in Utah for a little over 23 years now. However, you went through the Penn State or State College fly fishing program. You had a chance to be tutored and mentored by Joe Humphreys, a lot of his cohorts, et cetera, in the area. But then you also not only kind of graduated through the program, but you assisted in the master's program there at State College. You got really involved in targeting trout, specifically brown trout, and going after records and super high quality fish, etc. But then you kind of made a little bit of a change, and you went through this like transformational phase that a lot of people go through from anglers. In fact, I think now that there's so much information out there, more and more anglers are going through, and that's I was a trout angler in fly fishing because that's the primary entry area, but now I'm chasing all these other species, et cetera, and really trying to hone my skills through doing that. So we're going to talk today about your transformational change from trout to species chaser, and we're going to wrap up the end of the call with a tip that you have on how to break down a pool specifically for trout fishing, because you mentioned to me that that's probably one of the biggest things that you've really learned and started to hone as you've focused in on targeting that specific types of fish from a quality standpoint. So looking forward to it and glad to have you on the show here, Corbin. Why don't we just kind of jump in right away with a little bit more on your background? I remember you saying you started out as a young age spin fishing and then got into college. Tell us a little history about how you got engaged into the fly fishing program. If you don't mind the pup barking in the background, because she's never going to stop. She's just excited to hear about the fishing.
Yeah, no worries. No worries. Thanks, Christian, for having me on. I guess I started fishing 5, 6 years old. My grandmother had a stream that ran through her property, and Dad and Mom would drop us down there for the weekend, and we'd, my grandma would get us worms, and we'd just, throw the worms in, catch a lot of creek chubs, and occasionally a trout would wander its way into there, but mainly, creek chubs and minnows and crawfish and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Kind of went to Penn State as a spin angler, and it came around to second semester. First semester, I was carrying my spin rod and my fly rod. Just got a fly rod freshman year of college. Was carrying both, doing the, okay, when I feel like I need to fly fish, I'll fly fish kind of thing. And I told myself, well, if I really want to get good at this and I really want to learn this thing, I need to leave the spinning rod at home. So went back after Christmas break that year and left the spinning rod at home and really forced myself to fly fish and really haven't turned back.
What was that like first couple weeks back or month or whatever? Was it brutal or was it?
It was brutal.
Yeah.
It was brutal. That whole first year was brutal. But I mean, sticking with it, and then you get your first fish and your second fish, and you're like, okay, maybe I've got this thing figured out. Yeah. And you start talking to people, and I think the cool thing about fly fishing is the community. And you go into a local fly shop, or you meet a buddy who just started or has been doing it a long time. Everybody's willing to share info and usually willing to help out in the fly community, which is cool.
Do you think that was your biggest, I don't know, kind of way of getting over the hurdle? Was the community, or was it maybe something else?
I think it was. So I don't know. I'm a pretty social guy, so I think that was definitely part of it. And then shared experience between guys that I fished with and new people that I fished with definitely kept me coming back. But then, catching fish on a fly rod, everything that goes into it, you're constantly thinking, whether it's about your cast, whether it's about your flies, whether it's about your drift, whether it's about where the fish are in a pool or where, how the fish are eating, or it's a constant thinking game. So once I figured that out, it just took, the fact of just throwing some power bait up and letting it drift down through a pool just kind of totally went out the window. And so I think it was definitely the community thing kept me coming back. And then just the whole complexity of fly fishing kept me in it.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting to hear. Yeah. A lot of people, I think, get the complexity, but I see people work through it alone. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas having community can be really big. And it's interesting how some people learn different than others. Mine was, I did a ton of reading.
Yeah.
And after all the reading and I had my mental competency in place, that's when I started really reaching out to other anglers or talking to people in the parking lots. Because prior to that, I just felt like and maybe it was myself, but like they're going to be talking about stuff I don't even know what the hell they're talking about.
Hmm.
And it hurt my confidence more than anything, right?
Yeah, no, it
Um,
definitely does. And then, yeah, so transitioning like into sophomore year. So sophomore year was the first time I took a fly fishing class. So I had been 6 months into forcing myself to fly fish, jump into the class program. Mark Belden was the fly fishing instructor at the time. And then he would bring Humphreys in to do our casting classes like every week or every other week. I think it was a 2 day a week class, and Humphreys would come in and do our casting classes in the gym. And I remember like the first 3-4 weeks, Joe or Mark would name a fly pattern, blue-winged olive or, you know, something, girdle bug. And I'd be like, I have no idea what these guys are talking about.
right, right.
But yeah, after you kind of do a little research and understand, and you see it in text and you see it like on a whiteboard or wherever, it all kind of comes together, and that foreignness goes away. And the next thing you know, you're in conversation with everybody and you know what everybody's talking about. And you're just in the mix at that point.
Yeah.
So um,
What a
it was
cool
pretty
feeling
cool.
too, isn't it? Like
Yeah,
all of a sudden you're in that like, man, I'm engaged and I get it.
yeah. I
Right?
still don't know what I'm doing, but I kind of know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Had to be
um,
pretty cool learning from Humphreys. I mean, at the time you probably didn't necessarily understand his complete background and
didn't have
his
a clue at
history in
the
the
time.
sport.
Right.
But when you reflect back on that, were there some things in his teaching style that really stood out for you?
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously he's in his mid 90s now, so we're talking about late 70s, early 80s when he was teaching my class.
Mm-hmm.
And just his teaching style was very, very simple, very basic. Um, Nothing crazy. I mean, and he kept it simple, stupid, if for no better lack of a better term.
Yeah, and frankly, just like his fishing style, right? I mean,
Yeah,
his fishing style is very simplistic in nature.
yeah. And then so the following 2 years, then I worked a couple of programs with him and with the program where one of them we taught um, people from the inner city. Inner city
Hmm.
kids would come into the program and we teach them how to fly fish and teach them about fishing and how fish eat and that type of thing, which was really cool because these people had never really experienced really being outside and seeing a stream, let alone catching a fish on a fly rod, which was
Hmm.
cool. And then
Yeah.
also the other class we taught was, I think it was fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. So, kids. And Humphreys would always go and teach them the exact same way they teach us as college kids. And it was just interesting to see because the techniques were the same. The way that he went about it was the same. And um, just really, really cool all the way around.
Yeah. Yeah. What an amazing experience. And gosh, got to be grateful for that one. It's kind of like serendipitous in nature, right? Just being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a picture on my wall of me, Humphreys and Belton, and it's like that's probably my favorite picture that's ever been taken ever because of both of those guys. But it got me started into this rabbit hole that now I'm thinking about how many hours every week that is fly fishing.
Yeah. Wow.
So
Cool. Very, 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 very cool. So, let's dive into this whole change that you went through.
sure,
You really did focus in on the trout. You got, I mean, extremely proficient in it. I mean,
yeah,
you're helping and teaching classes, etc. You're having a lot of success there. But it sounds like you had that um, feverish kind of expectation of I just want to keep learning and
yeah.
trying new things. So tell us a little bit how you made that transformation there.
Yeah, so after college, I took my first job in the hardwood business. Actually, I was selling hardwood lumber for a company that had, I think it was 7 sawmills at the time, but it moved me to West Virginia, so rural West Virginia,
Hmm.
Petersburg area. And when I got there, I had the North Fork of the South Branch, which there's some great trout fishing right there at the bottom of the driveway where I was living. It was awesome. I mean, it couldn't have been better. Literally, get off work at the end of the day, go home, grab the fly rod, grab the black lab, jump in the truck, and just park at the bottom of my driveway.
Oh,
And
man.
I could fish. I was fishing 5, 6 days a week. No wife, no kids at the time. It was great. Um, and then I bumped into a buddy
Not
of
that it's
mine,
not
Zach.
great now, honey.
No, exactly. It's still good now. And actually, now my kids are getting involved and
Yeah.
they're into it, and it's all good. Um, but then I bumped into a buddy of mine, Zach Adkins, and Zach worked for the DCNR. He was he was park. He worked for the parks at the time. I'm not exactly
Okay.
sure what he was doing, but he was even more of an avid fisherman than I was, and helped run the blog for West Virginia Angler. And he was a big trout guy, but he was also a big multi-species guy. And I can remember like that first summer, we went through the winter, we trout fished all winter and into the spring, and then the summer hit, and the trout flows got bad. And he's like, "Hey, why don't we go float the Potomac for smallmouth? I got a frame raft. Let's go check out the smallmouth." He was a big smallmouth guy, still is a big smallmouth guy. So I jumped in his boat. I had no idea what to expect. Well, next thing I know, we're 9 hours into a float and 50 smallies deep, and I'm like, okay, so there are things beyond trout,
Trout,
and
right?
yeah,
And
the
they
smallmouth
smash
game
the
is,
fly, and
yeah,
they're
they hit hard
hot,
and they
and they're
fight
like,
hard. Yeah, yeah, they fight super hard. It's
yeah,
so that's kind of, I think that's where the transition started, and then from there it kind of just grew. I left Allegheny Wood after little over 2 years to take the job I'm in now and moved to Rhode Island. So I was in the middle of the striper world up on the coastal Rhode Island in Westerly. But then I also traveled across the Northeast. So every time I went somewhere, I'd carry the fly rods with me,
yeah,
and a lot of overnights. So instead of just hitting the bar after work, I'd jump out and see, okay, what can I fish for? So whether that be smallmouth, largemouth, trout still, or
yeah.
stripers, or pike, or whatever,
Panfish,
um,
whatever. He's like,
panfish, whatever. That's kind of where I started my Excel file of, okay, we're going to see how many species I can get. First goal is 50, then beyond that, there's 100 on there. So
yeah.
let's try to knock the species list up.
So you have an
Um,
Excel document, and I'm assuming some kind of checkbox of like, I got this one,
yep,
this one, this one, this one. Nice. And
yep. And I
what
try
number
to
are
take
you
as
at
many
now?
notes as possible. I'm at 48 right now.
Okay.
So
And
I
that's
try to take as
saltwater,
many notes.
freshwater, bunch of stuff.
Saltwater, freshwater, both. Yeah. So try to take notes on where I catch them, what I catch them on, date, that kind of thing. As much as I remember to put in there when I actually put them on there, kind of
Right,
thing.
right.
Yeah.
What's this goal you said is 50? Get to 50?
That's the first goal is 50. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then what's the next after that? Have you
Probably
set that?
75 and then 100.
Yeah,
Eventually, lifetime goal is 100 fish on 100 species on a fly, which is a lot because
yeah.
you get into minutia at some point, but um 50 is a good goal and I'm close. Um it went from checking, 3, 4, 5, 6 species off a year to like, okay, now I'm narrowing it down and I just got
It,
to pick and choose where I go and what I do.
right,
So,
right. I remember when I went to Florida and I was like, it was like 10 species in a week or something like
yeah,
that.
yeah, it's
I
crazy,
was like,
right?
this is awesome.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
you know, so it's pretty cool. Cichlids and Oscars and
Sure.
gar and snakehead and all these different. You're just like, oh my gosh, they're everywhere. Something
Yeah.
different. You know.
Speaking of that, I could probably go down there and pick up 5 or 6 just fishing those backwaters because I haven't fished that backwater at
Yeah,
all. So I could do all the peacock and cichlids and all that pretty quick.
yeah, that would get
So
you to your number for sure. Quick
yeah, no
trip.
doubt.
If you need some partners, let me know. I got friends down there. they'll
Good to
they'll
know.
show you
Good to
around.
know.
Yeah, yeah, it's always good. And then of course, I mean, for just a quick quip here on Florida. I mean, I fished Miami Bay and I was flabbergasted. Just like I had, I had never really thought about Florida of that type of fishing. The quality of fishing in there is just absolutely incredible. And to
Yeah.
be looking at Miami, I mean, you're just like, this is an alternative world, really wild. I think we all underappreciate Florida as a fishery in
Oh,
many
for
ways. I
sure.
mean, it's absolute world class, and
Yeah.
um,
I try to go every other year, but I've been focusing mainly West Coast,
mm,
um, Tampa, Fort Myers, Pine Island, Matlacha,
hmm
all that. Boca Grande Pass. Unfortunately, I was there last June, and both the place that we stayed and like two of the three restaurants we used to eat at on Matlacha are now gone because of the
Oh,
hurricane
wow.
last summer. It's
Uh,
nuts. I got a lot of good buddies down there that are guides, and man, it's a different world now than it was even 12 months ago.
oh, yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Sure. Well, let's get back on track here.
Yep.
So you got this species hunt. So tell us a little bit about like how you're going about it now, because you start out and it's like you said, it's pretty easy. You start picking up species because you're just like in your local waters and
Yep.
chasing different things that are in and around. But um, I'm interested to hear like what are you kind of doing now to target specific things? Are you going to areas in specific or whatnot?
Yeah. So um, a lot of it has to do with, okay, where am I traveling for work and how can it's ease of accessibility. I have
Mm-hmm.
three kids that are 6 and under. So the big long trips aren't as easy as they used to be. But once I know usually 6 months in advance what my bigger trips might be, and then I try to tag on to that.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that being going to San Diego, we did San Diego a few years back for leopard shark. I'm like, as soon as I saw San Diego, I'm like, okay, this is the trip. I'm going to go chase leopards. Or whether that be Florida and we're trying to catch tarpon, or um, this year we're doing. I have some customers down around Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. I'm actually leaving Monday morning bright and early,
Mm-hmm.
and we're gonna try to do the cobia thing. So um, cobia and big bull reds that are cruising high in the water column off the Bay
Mm-hmm.
Bridge Tunnel. So it's really that's how I've been doing it. I haven't done a ton of specific travel for just fishing, but I've done a little bit of that. But
Mm-hmm.
more or less, it's where my regular work's taking me, and then tacking it onto that.
Okay. So let's take a step back from that. And when you made the transition or started to, and then kind of really committed to it from trout to other species, talk about the carryover and techniques and things that you've also learned along the way, like, hey, this is a little different,
Sure.
etc.
Well, with trout, I mean, I think everybody starts as, okay, we're going to dry fly fish, and then maybe do a little bit of nymphing under an indicator. So you learn that first, and you kind of get proficient at that, and then you're like, okay, well, maybe I'll try the streamer game. And you're still throwing a floating line, but throwing a streamer and throwing a little bit heavier fly on maybe a bigger rod, like a 5 or 6 weight. Um, well, then you transition into either warm water or salt water, and you're immediately jumping. For the most part, you're almost immediately jumping up in rod class. So you're going from like a 4, 5, 6 weight. I fish for trout. I fish a 2 weight a lot, Euro style.
Yep.
Um, just because I like the feel of a 2 weight. I can feel everything that's in the stream and everything on the stream bottom with the 2 weight. Anyway, but you're going from that 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 maybe to, okay, I'm going to go chase steelhead, or I'm going to go chase smallmouth, and I'm going to a 7 or an 8 weight. So you're casting a bigger rod. I think that's the immediate thing you feel first is, okay, I gotta use a little bit more arm strength and a little more arm and a little more casting power to get the bigger fly out there, bigger line out there using a bigger rod.
Yeah.
And then you
And the
transition.
line thing, I think, is key
The
too,
line's
right? Like
huge, right?
on the smaller rods, you can kind of get away a lot of times, it seems, with like not really having enough line out, right?
Yeah.
But on the bigger rods, if you don't have enough line out, you don't have the weight in the line helping you bend that rod, and it can be brutal.
Yeah. And then transitioning from single haul to double haul,
Mm-hmm.
which I find myself even double hauling dry flies because I do so much of the warm water stuff that I'm like, oh,
Right.
well, it's less effort now. I can double haul a dry fly and
Right.
get it, you shoot it out like crazy. But
Yeah, it's crazy how proficient you can get with your trout rod once you've
yeah.
learned some of those other bigger casting techniques for bigger rods. Yeah.
And then really the last 5 years, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, I started the ESOC stuff, fishing for pike and muskies on 10, 11, and 12 weights and throwing these giant 6, 7, 8 inch flies around. It's like casting a wet sock.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think that's really where you start to realize, okay, this is where it's like, I compare it to like baseball, where before you go up to bat, you have a bat weight on your bat. Like if you're throwing a 12 weight around for 2 days and then you go back to fishing a 5 weight, you just feel like you're so much more nimble with that 5 weight because you've been
Mm-hmm.
throwing this big giant thing around. So I think that's the biggest transition is throwing different rods from low to high, and then different lines from low regular sinking lines all the way or floating lines all the way up to a sinking line.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of my musky lines are like a 500 plus grain full sink,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very very heavy line. But once you feel the rod and understand how that rod loads on a 500 grain line, you can shoot that 500 grain line a mile.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
once you figure it out.
Yeah. And with very little effort too. And
Mm-hmm.
I know when I fish streamers and, especially from like a boat situation, because I don't have a ton of opportunity to do that here locally, but I'll go on a trip and it's like big rod, heavy line all day long, and
Yeah.
you'll beat the hell out of yourself the day one,
Yep.
getting back into your rhythm, and then by day two you're like, what was I doing yesterday? Like, God, this is so easy to cast if I just let it cast, and I don't
Totally.
force it.
And I think I tell this to anybody, whether it's I'm fishing with a guide or I'm fishing with a buddy or whoever, like especially if I'm throwing a bigger rod on a boat. I tell everybody, hey, remind me to do less false casting because you really don't need it. Like tarpon fishing or even musky fishing, like 2, 3 false casts. That's it. You
Yeah,
don't need any more. You're literally wearing your arm out by false casting too much.
yeah,
So you can load that rod and usually two good false casts.
yeah, yeah. Big one is letting that line out in your back cast,
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
charging it up. The other thing I found that's real interesting when you start to transition to those weighted lines is it really teaches you how to aerial mend and use different casts
Mm-hmm.
because you can't correct your line. Once that 500 grain line hits the water, like you have like a microsecond to maybe make a mend, and it's really only
That's
going to
it.
be a half mend,
Yep.
um,
That's
and
it.
is far less effective, et cetera. So, learning how to manipulate your line in the air, which technically is an aerial mend, then you carry that back to a floating line in a trout situation where you're like doing a reach cast or a wiggle
Mm-hmm.
cast or something like that. Man, it's like what a game changer in setting up your flies.
Totally.
Yeah, even
Totally.
with a bobber on, like if you
Yeah.
learn how to do a reach cast with the indicator, rather than okay, I'm going to flap it out there, on a standard overhead cast or some kind of water loaded cast, and then I'm going to throw a mend in. You just gave away 6 feet of like sacrificial drift where you could
Mm-hmm.
have set it up right out of the get go.
Well, it's funny because I haven't done much drift boat fishing for anything, let alone trout. And we spent 4 days on the South Holston this spring with the South Holston River Lodge guys,
Oh yeah,
and like taking some of the things that we had in place for big, saltwater, big warm water stuff, and then throwing that on a 5 weight with an indicator, and then letting like drift mending your fly line. We were getting these stupid long drifts out of a drift boat that I didn't even think existed.
yeah,
Like 150 yard drifts, like you were center pinning almost, where you're just mending the crap out of it at the
right,
top end of the drift and letting it go. And then we were hooking fish at the end of those drifts. I'm like,
right.
I've never seen this before. This is
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah,
Um,
and you're like flabbergasted that when you did your lift, and your guide probably told you like, hey, when you do your lift, don't just yank it out, like lift slow and feel for the set,
yeah,
and
yeah.
it's like an emerger like swinging up, kaboom,
And then they're
gosh,
eating it on the swing, in the very
yeah,
end swing. Yeah,
really
no,
cool.
totally. I was shocked, and then I took that into the waiting game a little bit and did some long drifts on the when I was waiting, and I'm like, wow, this is just a new technique that I can use when I'm not Euro fishing, um, on some of the bigger water that we fish, like Pine Creek and things like that, in northern PA.
Yeah, well, your local guy there, George Daniels. I mean, his book Dynamic Nymphing, he's talked specifically about that. Like the
Yep.
whole premise of dynamic nymphing is that I'm going to use what's best for what the river is giving me, and if I can get a 30-foot drift with an indicator that's like a perfect drift, I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Versus trying to tightline it. He's like, I might pick a section out of it to go back to and tight line or start out with, but if I can get a big drift or whatever in a long pool, I'm going to go for it.
Yeah.
So really cool.
No doubt. No doubt. So
Well, let's do this. We got a few minutes left here to kind of jump into some of the other things that you were talking about, and that's your tip about how to break down a hole. I know that's going to take a little more time than, or could take a little more time than we usually do for a tip because it's such a detailed process. So why don't you break it down for us of, from your walk up to how you might read the water and then fish it.
yeah, so like if I'm approaching for example, like a tail out pool, which is what I like to fish the most, is which I think most fly guys are like. If we see a big tail out, we're like, okay, like your mouth starts watering, you start like
Right.
getting edgy. You're like,
You're like,
that's what I want to see. This
you're
big
like,
tail
what
out at
time
the end
is
of a
it? It's
riffle.
fish
Yeah,
catching time.
and you're like, I'm gonna spend 25 minutes at this one spot. Um, big thing for me, first off, is I like to fish upstream, but if I can't fish upstream, I'm not afraid to get out of the water and get out and around a pool, because that approach from down up is important to me. Um, Something that we, at Penn State, we were always thinking about is like, okay, so how are fish sitting in a pool for the most part? Well, they're fishing, they're facing with their head facing into the current. So if you're coming down on a pool from top down, there's a chance you spook fish. So
Mm-hmm.
going from bottom up is big. And usually in one of those big tailouts, you've got like this slow gravel section at the very bottom end, the back end, where fish will hang in that bottom tailout. Then you've got like the belly of the pool. This is generic because we all know,
Right.
this could
Each,
be, it varies depending on the stream, but like every major tailout basically looks like this. It's a big gravel, bottom of the tailout. There's a big belly, and then it gets into like almost a hard break off before the riffle section starts.
mm-hmm. Yep.
And then a lot of the times, if you're looking dead upstream, either to the right or the left of that tail out, there's usually a back eddy,
Mm-hmm.
with a back eddy on the left or right. Well, first off, a lot of times I find my biggest fish in that back eddy. It takes them the least amount of effort to hang there. The food's still flowing through. They can pick and choose what they eat, and it takes as little effort from them from a calorie burn standpoint. So they're usually hanging there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's usually where I find the biggest fish. Um, so I'll work my way to that. I'll fish the bottom end of the pool, then I'll fish the big belly section, then I'll even fish where it breaks right off, where the drop off is, and then I work my way over to that. Either work my way on the inside or my outside tail or eddy, because usually that back eddy or that front eddy is usually where some of the bigger fish are hanging.
Mm-hmm.
So, but knowing that you're tricking the fish into eating instead of feeding the fish is also the big thing. So, making that fly go through there with as little drag as possible, things like that. If you're tight lining, keeping that line as tight as possible so you feel every little bump, everything on the bottom, and able to get that hook set in. So, if I'm wade fishing, that's how I approach and how I break down that pool.
Yeah. When you fish back into the pool, are you pretty cognizant about pulling those fish out? Like, where am I going to get them so I don't disturb some of those other areas?
I try to. I've also, though, like, sometimes it's impossible when that fish immediately runs upstream.
Right.
And yes, I worry about it to a degree, but I notice, like, a lot of times when that fish runs upstream, you'll see another fish that'll hang right to it. Or
Mm-hmm.
like the same thing happens like when you're smallmouth fishing and you hook a fish, like all of a sudden another two smallmouth are right next to it.
They're like, hey,
So
what's going on, buddy? Where
yeah,
are you going?
exactly,
I thought
exactly.
we were
Like
getting cheeseburgers.
I think, yeah, exactly. I think like the spook factor is, I think we all kind of blow it out sometimes more than it really is.
Yeah.
It's definitely there. Don't get me wrong, but um, yeah, that's kind of how I look
It's
at it.
also dependent for me too on like maybe the time of the day or how my day's been going.
Hmm.
Like if I've gotten into a handful of fish and I'm like, you know what, I just want to target the big guy. I might skip,
Yeah.
portions of that pool. I might skip
Oh, for
the
sure.
tail out end and go, you know what, I'm just going to go, like you said, to the eddy. And then for me, the next is the shelf. Where's a drop off?
Yeah.
And I'm a little more of a drop off guy, I think, from where I feel like I get my best fish.
Hmm.
But knowing that like, hey man, I'm going to toss it up there. If it's a dry fly, I want to make sure I get it enough up into the riffle above so that
So
when
it
it comes
naturally comes
over that
down.
edge, it's natural. It's not like landing on the edge and too late And the same thing with my nymphs. If I'm tight lining or fishing with a bobber, like I want to be able to get it up enough high to where I can either stall my rod tip and lift and increase my angle to get the fly to drop, or
Hmm.
I can, do a roll cast mend onto my bobber to get it to shoot back and allow my fly to drop right over that edge into the feed zone.
I think that's something else to think about too. When that when those flies drop off that edge, it almost sometimes feels like they hang there forever. I mean, they'll just kind of sit there and just sit there. If you're tight lining, especially, they'll just
Yeah,
sit there. That's a good thing. A lot of times they'll sit there and it'll surprise me because they've been sitting there so long, and then all of a sudden you get an eat.
yeah,
Like, it's like they're sitting down there almost like in that little
that like
washing machine.
swirling, yeah,
Yeah, they're sitting
eddy,
in that washing machine, and that fish is looking at it, and eventually he's like, "Oh, I think I'm going to eat it," and then he just eats
yeah,
it. It may take time. Don't be afraid of that. You know, don't be afraid of that sitting there for a while because it will.
right,
It
right,
sometimes it will. Or like, I noticed it in um, North Carolina. I used to fish North Carolina a lot, like the mountain right, like as you got into the Smokies, and they have these big boulder pools, like where there's just these giant big boulders, and there's
mm,
big eddies behind every one of them. Put a fly in every one of those holes because even though there might not be a lot of current moving through there might be fish sitting right on that feeder seam, and as soon as something hits in there, they eat it right away.
yep,
So,
yep,
uh, yeah,
yeah. It's there's so many little techniques, but one of the ones that I love too is like when you're fishing an indicator and you get into that stall situation where your indicator
hmm,
is just kind of hanging out and stalling. A lot of times, what I like to do is actually just lift my indicator off the water and see if
yep,
it stays there. Because is that the high water column current that's keeping me there, or is it the low water call? And
right,
and when I start the lift, if it stays there, I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna hold it here until it moves on and on. But sometimes you're like, oh my gosh, that thing's boogieing now, and I know that drift wasn't good. So the next round through, I'll just straight tight line it with the indicator on it, or I'll pull
yeah,
my indicator off because I know I'm not getting the right drift. Little things like that, and then your boulder situation. I'm the same way. And one of my favorite things to do there is I put on two really heavy flies, usually jig flies, and I
yep,
throw it up ahead of the boulder, let it come down in, bump the top. But it's for me, the critical aspect is really trying to get that fly, like if this is your boulder, to come down, like almost bump off the boulder and like
seam
roll
in, yeah, like roll
along
into
the
the seam,
seam into the
yeah,
hole because it just seems like for me, if I was a fish, there's got to be some kind of hydraulic in under the edge of the boulder that they're holding in and then getting it out into that hole. You're like right in the zone on the backside too. And I
yeah,
always think of my buddies were up on Bear Trap Canyon one year and fly fishing and not catching anything. And lo and behold, this bear comes down, like walks out to a boulder, like, "Hey, what's up?" And just reaches under the boulder and like pulls out this big rainbow and starts eating it. And they're like, "Are you kidding me? We've been fishing here for like 3 hours or kind of thing, and you come out and smash this like master rainbow right in front of us, And
right.
it was like right under the side. So, hmm. Well, cool, man. I think it was really interesting learning about how you approach that. What about some of the when you talk about your getting your drifts right and fishing those holes? What are some of the like gear changes that you like to make to facilitate that as you go through those holes and the different situations like the back eddy sides, etc. Ensure you get in the right drift.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with weight. So, like you were mentioning with your boulder situation where you're throwing two or three big heavy flies, getting down in the proper scenario, or lightening up so that you're not just constantly snagging the bottom and knowing where the fish are feeding too. So, because sometimes you'll notice in some of those just regular riffle runs that those fish are feeding mid water column, and if you're on
Hmm.
the bottom, they're not always going to eat that fly when it's right on the bottom when they're feeding on emergers. So in that scenario, a lot of times I'll switch to, even if the fish aren't rising, I'll switch to a dry dropper, and I'll run like a big dry fly with a dropper that's 6, 8, 10, 12 inches under the water, just so it looks like an emerger,
Hmm.
and end up start catching fish on emergers. So a lot of times I'm fishing when I'm tight line. Euro nipping or even under an indicator anymore, I'm throwing a lot of girdle bug patterns or big heavy fly as my anchor fly, and then I'm
Hmm.
throwing something off of that, whether that's one or two flies, to hit multiple water columns and hit multiple fly species scenarios.
Yeah, and I've gotten more and more into that similar scenario where I didn't do it before. It was like I just picked a fly, right? And um, now a lot of times I'll really try to think about like what portion of the water column am I in,
Hmm.
and what kind of fly would be in there. Like for example, an aquatic worm, I always kind of think of an aquatic worm being in like a mid column scenario.
Yeah,
So I don't fish it as much on the point as I used to. Um, or an emerger. Emerger is going to be higher up in the column.
right,
Um, so I'm going to
right.
fish that a little higher, all those scenarios. And
Yeah, and I mean
whether
here in
it's true or
PA,
not, or they care, I have no idea. But for me, the
yeah,
angler, it makes me feel so much more competent and comfortable. And that's a big part of it.
no doubt. And I mean, I still think shape. I think color is important, but I think shape is everything when it comes to your nymphs and when you're nymph fishing. But when you're in a place like Pennsylvania and say it's mid to late May on Penns Creek, I mean the amount of different bugs that could come off in a given day.
Yeah,
You could hit sulfurs, March browns, you could see blue wing olives, you could
yeah,
see green drakes, you could see. I mean, there's so many bugs in that water column. So I think it's more for our headspace than anything. Is like, okay,
yeah,
what am I trying to accomplish here? What column am I trying to fish? What am I trying to imitate? And why?
yeah,
And I think that's more for us than anything. But you know, at the end of the day, get those flies in the feeder seam, and you're probably going to catch fish.
yeah,
So it's interesting to think about. And then you go some other places where there's very very limited bugs that are in a body of water. So I don't know. It's interesting to think about.
yeah. It is like what's the prolific hatch of the area, or what is
Yep.
the just what are they consuming? Sometimes I go out and I fish areas, and like we were up at a place the other day fishing, and there were PMDs everywhere, and it was like, oh
Hmm.
man, like you could see them eating on top, and but they weren't eating the PMDs, they were eating some kind of merger and underneath, and then it was like, oh, we start chasing one of the mergers and trying to figure that out, and yeah, we were
Yeah.
getting into fish, but it wasn't like super hot, and then it was like, you know what? There's tons of sow bugs in here. Why don't we just fish some sow bugs and see how that goes? And it was like lights
Yeah.
out, like boom, 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 boom. You're like, oh my gosh, like
Yeah.
they just eat them all day long.
Meat and
That's why the
potatoes is what
fish
I
were
call it.
such high quality. Is the sow bugs were so protein rich and whatnot.
Yep.
So
Yep. Spring Creek that runs through State College is a sow bug factory. So like
yeah,
just throwing a muskrat nymph, 95% of the time is all you really need to throw.
yeah,
And you're gonna catch fish.
yeah.
So
You were talking about Penns Creek earlier. That canyon section of Penns Creek is really cool too. I fished
yep.
that a couple years ago with a buddy. He lives down in there, and man, really cool. I remember um, really cool kind of section. We stopped and we're like eating lunch, and I look over and there's like this down log and hanging out, and I'm like, I'm gonna go over there and nymph the crap out of that thing, see how it goes. And sure enough, poured like 4 or 5 fish, like really high quality, right out from underneath there. I was like,
Yeah.
yes, that was so worth it.
Well, I think it's almost like the other thing that Central Pennsylvania has unfortunately done to me is like it is so good, and the quality of the wild fish here is so good that I go to other places. I'm like, man, yeah, the fishing's good, but these are all stock fish. Where is the wild? Where can we find wild?
Right. Yeah.
So I think more and more as I get into this rabbit hole, I'm like, okay, where can I find wild fish? I don't have to be big, but where can I find wild fish?
Yeah.
So, um, and I think that's you evolve. I
Yeah.
love fishing for stock trout. Don't get me wrong; it's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with it. And now it's more like, okay, when can I take my son, he'll be 4 on Saturday tomorrow. Um, we went out and we caught stock trout on Father's Day, and he just had a blast. I'm like,
Oh
this is
yeah.
great. This is the best.
Yeah.
This is the best. So, um,
That's too
it's just
cool.
cool.
Too cool. Yeah, man. You probably had a wonderful experience down in West Virginia. I mean, all the blue
Yeah,
lining and whatnot down there. I mean, it's incredible. You
yeah,
know,
it's awesome. West Virginia is a really, really, really cool place.
it is.
It's just so much ground with so few people, and it's just a really, really cool place.
Yeah, it's beautiful country. Well, hey Corbin, great having you on the show, man. Thanks for tuning us up on your species chase, and I wish you all the best and get to that 50 here as quickly as possible. But I wish you even more on getting to your 100. I know that's a major goal of you, and you start stacking them. And you got places you want to go. You give me a call. I'll go anywhere and try and hunt some species with you. It sounds like just an absolute blast, man.
Yeah, man, for sure. I appreciate the time on here, and we'll definitely get together, make some tight lines here soon.
For sure. All right, everybody. We'll see you guys next week.